Good morning, everyone. The committee will come to order. We are here this morning for three closely related purposes. First, we will examine federal revenues that are generated from energy development on our federal lands, Indian lands, and federal offshore areas. Secondly, we will explore how that revenue is distributed among federal programs and shared with the state, local, and tribal governments. And then finally, we will hear testimony on two measures that would boost revenue sharing from onshore renewable as well as offshore development. Both of the bills under consideration are sponsored by members of this committee. Senator Cassidy has introduced S-2418, which is the Coastal Act, and Senator McSally has introduced S-2666, which is a Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act. As a co-sponsor of the Coastal Act, I want to thank Senator Cassidy for introducing legislation that would bring revenue sharing for coastal producing states into parity with onshore development. Congress laid the foundation for offshore revenue sharing through the passage of the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, GOMESA, back in 2006. At that time, the bill did not include Alaska. The Coastal Act that we are considering now would establish a revenue sharing program that would include Alaska. And at the current time, our offshore production is pretty minimal, and therefore any returns to the state are equally minimal. It is important to address this at this time. In fact, some of us would say it is well overdue in terms of timing to address it. The Coastal Act would do for Alaska what it does for other producing states, such as those in the Gulf of Mexico, in terms of being able to provide offshore revenue sharing for the state to help meet a number of critical purposes, including the protection of our coasts, assistance for villages that are grappling with the effects of climate change, the development of lower cost and clean energy generation, which is so important for us in the state, as well as assistance for our university system and just all that comes with our efforts to turn our non-renewable resources into long-term assets. To me, offshore revenue sharing is a matter of simple fairness. The Beaufort and the Chukchi Seas and Cook Inlet are American waters by virtue of Alaska and Alaska alone. We build the infrastructure and provide the public services that are needed for responsible development, but we also bear the impacts. And as we've heard Senator Cassidy say many times before this committee, that those who shoulder much of that burden, it is only right that they should share in a greater opportunity for the benefit. So let's talk about some of the benefits from revenue sharing. A few weeks ago, the Department of the Interior announced that it distributed over $11.6 billion in revenue from natural resources production in FY 2019. That's significantly higher than last year's disbursement of $8.9 billion. Much of it will be reinvested back into our public lands, waters, and Native American and rural communities. For example, this year, $2.4 billion went to the states and local governments that host energy development. Another $1.1 billion was dispersed to Native American tribes and tribal members that undertake resource extraction on Native American lands. And $1.7 billion in mineral royalties and hydropower revenue went to the Reclamation Fund, which supports federal dam and irrigation systems that move and store precious water supplies across the West. We talk a lot in this committee about land and water conservation fund and all that it provides, programs like the American Battlefield Protection Program, Forest Legacy Program, and the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Programs. But LWCF, I think those of us who know and understand the program, is really one of the biggest beneficiaries of offshore energy development. Since the 1990s, nearly all revenue credited annually to LWCF has been from outer continental shelf receipts. LWCF also receives additional mandatory appropriations under GOMESA. During FY 2018, the LWCF stateside program received $76 million from GOMESA leases. These substantial revenues only exist because we are the world's top producer of oil and gas. In recent years, we've seen new ideas emerge for how to allocate the revenues that result from our production, whether to address the park's maintenance backlog or to help with the recovery of wildlife. But we've also seen proposals to cut off federal oil and gas production, and some would suggest cut it off immediately without any consideration of the economic consequences which would prevent us from addressing those needs. So as we push for the development of new and cleaner technologies, which I think we certainly encourage that here in this committee, including our renewable energies, we also have to consider what it means for federal revenue disbursements. When we think about our solar assets, our wind assets, I think we recognize that when you look to what they have generated in terms of revenues, they're a mere fraction of the billions of dollars that are generated by oil and gas. So when we think about the benefits of LWCF and how LWCF has been structured, certainly historically, I think it is important to keep these considerations in mind. We'll have an opportunity to review some of the proposals that Senator McSally has outlined in her legislation to create streamlined permitting for renewables while sharing revenues from renewable energy development with local governments. So we've got a lot to talk about here today. I'm glad that we have witnesses today who are from both state and local governments that are the beneficiaries of federal revenue sharing programs and who can help explain what these revenues actually mean for them. So I look forward to hearing how they would support or how they do support communities with the funds that they receive with the development in their backyard. I also want to particularly thank Mayor Brower. He's come a pretty long way, came from the top of the world, as we say, in Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, but we know it's a long haul, and we appreciate the fact that you have made this journey to be with us today to share your comments. For that, I will turn to Senator Manchin, then we'll have an opportunity to introduce more fully all of our witnesses today.
Thank you, Chairman Mikowski. I appreciate it very much, and all of you all attending and making an effort to be here. And I've been where you come from, Mayor, and you have come a long way, and we appreciate that effort you've made. Today, we are discussing two revenue-sharing bills, which Senator Mikowski has mentioned: Senator Cassidy's bill, the Coastal Act, and Senator McSally's bill, the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act. My home state of West Virginia is a small state, and we have more private land than federal land. So I'm trying to understand, get up to speed on all these issues, and it's really quite fascinating. As a result, West Virginia receives very little of the revenue that we're going to be discussing today. In 2018, West Virginia received $93,000 for the whole year. So you can imagine, and I'll explain to you why I have a hard time understanding all this. However, we are similarly situated to some of my colleagues on the committee who do receive the lion's share when it comes to federal revenue sharing, and that we are rich in natural resources. So coal and more recently natural gas have provided funds to my state for a long time. Today, these resources are still a key source of revenue for our state budget through the collection of severance taxes collected from coal and natural gas operations. The model for disbursement in West Virginia, and I was governor for 2 terms, so we did this in such a fair manner. We just treated all 55 counties the same as if they would have been the producing counties. And a lot of them weren't producing anything, but they're all part of our great state. We're part of this great country. We get very little of any of this. And this is owned by the people of the country. So I'm very interested in this process now that I know more about it. So it's been very enlightening. Each year, the Department of Interior's Office of Natural Resources Revenue, which is the ONRR, collects billions of dollars in rents, royalties, and bonus bids from oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters. The geographic location of these leases determines the disbursement of the royalty after it's collected, which makes no sense to me at all, but that's the way they do it. So I don't know when that bill was written or that law and who got that in. In fiscal year 2019, the ONR dispersed a total of $11.6 billion of both offshore and onshore revenue. 11.6. We got 93,000. There are significant differences between how revenues from leases on onshore and offshore lands are divided up, and I think it's important that we examine both of these contracts and constructs. The chairman and I have had conversations regarding the importance of revenue sharing to coastal states, particularly because of the impact of the offshore energy production to a coastal state's infrastructure. I got it. It makes all the sense. As we know, before the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security, or GOMESA as we know it, became law, 100% of the oil and gas revenues beyond the first 3 miles of federal waters went to the U.S. Treasury, reflecting the belief that these resources are federal resources, and revenue raised from their extraction must benefit all taxpayers because it's federal, not state-owned. GOMESA established the first revenue-sharing program for waters managed by the Department of Interior in the Outer Continental Shelf, which will be referred to as the OCS. Today, 4 states receive 37.5% share of the revenue from the federal Gulf of Mexico, or Outer Continental Shelf. Now, 27% of the revenue from the 4th through 6th nautical mile, which we call HG zone, that was, I think, back in the 50s or 60s, I understand. When what they did, just common sense, they went, we get 100% for 3, give us 3 more. Well, we'll take 27% because we got nothing before. 100% of nothing is nothing. So we got 27. That's how that one, they explained to me, that one came about. So that totaled almost $223 million of those 4 states in fiscal year 2019. This is in addition to the states receiving already 100% of the revenue from the first 3 nautical miles, which are considered state waters or part of the state boundary. Under GOMESA, LWCF, which is Land Water Conservation Fund, also receives 12.5% of the qualified federal Outer Continental Shelf revenue beyond the H8G zone, which is, I guess, another 200 miles out. Onshore revenue sharing is governed by a different law. And while I know that this committee has examined the difference between how onshore and offshore revenues are handled in the past, I think that issue is worthy of additional attention from this committee. The primary distinction between the two is that onshore lands are contained entirely within the state's borders, while leases offshore are not within the state border. Onshore and offshore energy development also have different histories, with different leasing systems under the management of different bureaus within the department. With that history in mind, changing the policy for how revenues are dispersed from federal lands and waters, whether it be onshore or offshore, requires a factual understanding of the complexities of the broader energy market and should not be done without careful analysis. It is also important that we make sure these resources are being properly managed by the federal government in the first place. Over the last few years, both the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management have come up short in ensuring that taxpayers receive fair market value for the resources extracted from the public lands and waters those agencies are responsible for management. In September, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO office, published a report discussing how the BOEM conservatively estimates the values of the lands it leases and even lowers the valuation of these lands to justify when it awards the bids. I repeat, it justifies lowering the valuation when it awards bids. I have also long been concerned about the unnecessary venting and flaring of natural gas on public lands, which we do not do when it's an individual or it's a private company, because that's a value. So we're venting on private lands. When gas is vented, I think you all know what I'm talking about there, and flared for purely economic reasons. That gas never makes it to the market, the royalties never collected, and not one of us benefit at all. And they give me the excuse that there's no pipelines because they don't have a gathering system. We can fix that, but we should not be. vetting this on one easy way to increase revenues to ensure that most gas possible reaches the market and a royalty is collected. That will require conversation about pipeline infrastructure, which we will do. But these are important conversations because reducing venting and flaring on public lands is not only a taxpayer fairness issue to all of us, it's a positive step towards addressing climate change. It's a big win-win for all of us. We are a nation that has been blessed with vast natural resources that have helped make our nation the superpower it is today and hopefully to remain. While we enjoy these abundant federal resources, discussion of how the revenue should be shared is an extremely important one. I look forward to discussing these two different proposals. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. It's clear that these are issues that are important to the regions, important to the country, but also understanding where one another comes from is what will allow us to be able to really address the intricacies and the complexities. I'm going to ask Senator Cassidy to speak briefly to his bill. Senator Barrasso has indicated that he would like to make the introductions for Mr. Luthi this morning, which we are happy to do so. And I would like to acknowledge the presence of our friend here to the committee, Senator Mary Landrieu from Louisiana. Senator Landrieu occupied the position of both ranking and chairman of this committee, and certainly made this issue a priority of hers and her state, and Senator Cassidy has stepped right into that. So Senator Cassidy, if you would like to speak to your bill that you have introduced and that I have co-sponsored, the Coastal Act, and then we'll allow for introduction of our guests.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first let me say, I enjoyed Senator Manchin's comments, but there's some things that are a little misleading. And not that you intended to.
Not at all.
But I think it needs to be clarified.
I appreciate that. I thought it was very factual, but I appreciate the
It was absolutely. But Louisiana and the 4 Gulf Coast states do not get 37.5% of everything produced out there. There's a cap of $500 million.
And you don't hit the cap yet.
And it is also production after a certain date certain, after a certain point in time. So it's not the entirety of it. And I'll show a graph. And also, we're always a little puzzled that federal waters are federal land, but federal land within a state boundary is not federal land for the purposes of how we do this.
I understand.
That always seems a distinction without a difference.
Within the boundaries.
Yes. So that said, to continue with my formal remarks, thank you, Madam Chair, for calling this hearing. Protecting revenues that go to Louisiana and other Gulf Coast states, increasing the share we receive for coastal restoration, hurricane and flood protection is one of my top priorities on this committee. In our state, by our state constitution, we use that money to rebuild our coastline. A coastline which is eroded in large measure because the Mississippi River was levied for the benefit of inland ports. And when you have a levying of a river which distributes sediment and therefore helps to build and rebuild for the benefit of the tributaries of the Mississippi River, there seems to be some equity involved in terms of helping our state rebuild. It also is common sense, because if we get whacked by a hurricane, the federal government ends up spending a lot of money to rebuild that which was whacked. So I've introduced legislation with others on this committee. The Conservation of America's Shoreline, Terrain, and Aquatic Life, or the Coastal Act, which is part of today's hearing, to create a more equal revenue sharing treatment for states producing offshore energy revenue, a kind of equivalent, if you will, to those that produce onshore. Now, for context, the Gulf accounts for approximately 16% of the nation's crude oil supply and 3% of the nation's natural gas. Recently, the EIA reported energy production in the Gulf set a record of 1.8 million barrels per day, with forecasts that production will continue increasing as other offshore facilities come online and technology evolution allows existing sites to become more efficient and productive. In 2018, Interior dispersed almost $9 billion to the federal treasury, state and local governments, tribes, and the Bureau of Reclamation from onshore and offshore energy production, and funds such as the Land Water Conservation Fund and Historic Preservation Fund also received funding. But let's just kind of break this down, if you can open this up. Stand up, please. So here we see, come a little bit forward, please. Above here is the federal offshore, below is the federal onshore. And we can see that offshore, that the U.S. Treasury has received about $3.1 billion over this time frame. This is Go Mesa there, quite a small fraction of the total amount of money dispersed. Here is the Land Water Conservation Fund is authorized, and the Historic Preservation is authorized, and other offshore disbursements. But here's the onshore. The Treasury gets $0.41 billion, but state and local governments get almost $1.6 billion, with reclamation funds getting 1.2, and then other onshore disbursements. It should also be noted that in the Land Water Conservation Fund, a significant amount of this goes to states with onshore federal lands, so they're not only receiving roughly 50% share of the revenue from onshore, but they're also receiving dollars from the Land Water Conservation Act. And so, if you will, this is, you're getting it here and you're getting it there, and sometimes there is righteous indignation when you say that's not fair. I would argue that if we're going to have this, we should have this as roughly equivalent. I'm not saying take from here, but I am saying allow the coastal states to use their dollars to rebuild the coastline, which in large measure has been lost in pursuit of policies which benefit inland states. I will also say in yesterday's testimony, it mentioned in New Mexico that these funds can be used for school programs and roads and other capital expenses. In our state, it's substantially dedicated to coastal restoration. Again, more limitations. So just to repeat, states and local governments receive roughly 50% of the federal revenues derived from onshore oil and gas and the federal land in that state. And then Gulf Coast states share 37.5% from offshore energy production. The Coastal Act seeks to address obvious inequity, removing an existing cap on the amount of dollars shared among the 4 Gulf states and the Land Water Conservation Fund, raising the percent of offshore revenue that can be shared by the Gulf states in eligible areas from 37.5 to 50%. It protects offshore dollars from sequestration and makes leases entered into between 2000 and 2006 eligible for revenue sharing in the future. Currently, again, only revenues after 2006 are considered eligible. It creates a separate revenue sharing for the state with the largest amount of coastline, which is Alaska. My state is dealing with a land loss crisis, threatening ecosystems and communities, economies and way of life. Again, as I mentioned, in Louisiana's Constitution, the funds we receive go to, from revenue sharing, go to protecting and rebuilding our coastline. I believe Chairman Klein will speak specifically to this, but my Gulf colleagues and I are looking for is equity and the ability to strengthen environmental protection efforts. The states are producing the revenues. The states know how to allocate the dollars in ways that will benefit our states and also our nation. Thank you for holding the hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator. I'll go ahead and turn to my colleague, Senator Brasso, for his introduction of Randall Luthi, and then I will introduce the rest of the panel. Senator Brasso.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and it's really a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Randall Luthi. And I will tell you, Madam Chairman, that when I say colleague, he and I spent time together in the Wyoming legislature. I was a member, and he was the Speaker of the House. So he was really a good friend, and now he is the energy advisor to Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon, an attorney, a rancher, former speaker. He has fought and brought considerable insight and experience to the governor's office. Prior to joining the governor's office, Randall was president of the National Offshore Ocean Industries Association. He served in the Department of Interior as the Director of the Minerals Management Service and as Deputy Director of the Department's Fish and Wildlife Service. So I had the pleasure of serving with him in the legislature for many years. I'm proud to continue to work with him and so grateful for his friendship and working together with him on behalf of the people of Wyoming. Welcome, Randall, and we all look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. Certainly, Mr. Luthi, you have been no stranger to this committee. We have seen you in your various capacities before, so welcome back. We're also joined this morning by Mr. Gregory Gould, who is the Director of the Office of Natural Resources and Revenue at the U.S. Department of Interior. We appreciate what you do at Interior. I mentioned my friend and a leader from the North Slope Borough, Mayor Harry Brower. He has been a leader in so many different areas, not only as mayor of our North Slope Borough, but a significant whaling captain in his own right, and truly a significant voice in our northern part of the state. Ms. Laura Kame is the specialist in natural resources policy, natural resources and earth sciences section at CRS, the Congressional Research Service. We appreciate you being here and providing a little bit of historical perspective here. Mr. Klein has been mentioned. Kyle Chip Klein Jr. is the Director of Coastal Activities for Governor John Bell Edwards from Louisiana and is the Chairman of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Board. So we welcome you and your input this morning. And of course, Mr. Luthi, welcome. So with that, we will commence your statements. We would ask that you try to limit your comments to about 5 minutes. Your full statements will be included as part of the record, and then we'll have an opportunity to share in a little bit of back and forth here this morning. So Mr. Gould, if you would like to start off, please.
Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss S 2418, the Coastal Act of 2019. I would also like to submit this written testimony from BLM on section 2666, since I plan to focus my work today on Coastal Act. We'll include that as part of the record. Thank you. Thank you. The Coastal Act would change the current revenue sharing laws and provide additional revenue from energy production from the Outer Continental Shelf to coastal states. The Department of Interior and the administration are committed to ensuring that American taxpayers receive a fair return from the sale of these public resources. The department manages the public lands and federal waters that provide resources critical to the nation's energy security. The Office of Natural Resource Revenue, or HONOR, is responsible for the management of revenues associated with federal onshore, offshore, and American Indian leases. The lands and resources managed by the department are vast. Onshore, the 34 states where federal leases are located, over 25.5 million acres are currently under lease. Offshore, the department has made almost 80 million acres available for development in each of the past 5 offshore lease sales. In the Gulf of Mexico, there are over 13 million acres under active lease. And in Alaska, there are an additional 275,000 acres under lease. These onshore and offshore lands are a huge economic engine. In fiscal year 2018, 1/4 of domestic oil production, approximately 15% of natural gas production, and close to half of U.S. coal production occurred on interior managed lands and waters. In fiscal year 2016, HONOR dispersed $6 billion. In fiscal year 2018, that number grew to $9 billion. And in fiscal year 2019, disbursements exceeded $11.6 billion, almost double the amount in fiscal year 2016. The fiscal year 2019 disbursements included $5.2 billion to the U.S. Treasury, $1.7 billion to the Reclamation Fund, $1.1 billion to American Indian tribes and individuals, $1 billion to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, $150 million to the Historic Preservation Fund, and $2.4 billion to state and local governments. Of the $2.4 billion dispersed to state and local governments this year, $2.2 billion was dispersed to states with onshore leases on federal lands, and the remaining $225 million was dispersed to states with leases on or adjacent to the Outer Continental Shelf. Production of oil on federal lands and waters has also increased in the same time period. In fiscal year 2016, oil production totaled 749 million barrels. In fiscal year 2017, that number grew to 803 million barrels, and in fiscal year 2018, it exceeded 831 million barrels, an increase of 11% from fiscal year 2016. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to enact laws governing the property belonging to the United States. Our federal resources are managed on behalf of the American people, who all share in their ownership. There is a long history of Congress making and changing laws pertaining to these federal resources on behalf of the states, tribes, local governments, and U.S. taxpayers. The administration's policy is to promote clean and safe development of our nation's vast energy resources, and it is Honor's mission to collect, account for, and verify natural resource revenues due to the states, American Indians, and the U.S. Treasury. Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee, I thank you for inviting me here today, and I am happy to answer any questions the committee may have on the Coastal Act of 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Mayor Brower, welcome, and we appreciate your comments this morning.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski, Senator Manchin, and members of the committee. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this morning, inviting me to speak about legislation that would establish offshore oil and gas revenue sharing for Alaska and our coastal communities. My name is Harry Brower Jr. I have lived in Utqiagvik, Alaska, and I serve as the mayor of the North Slope Borough, the largest municipality in the United States in size. North Slope Borough stretches more than 600 miles from east to west. It's home to 8 Inupiaq villages, the Prudhoe Bay oil field, the National Petroleum Reserve, and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is appropriate that I have an opportunity to talk to you today about revenue sharing for our coastal communities. In Alaska, November 7 is Eben Hobson Day. Eben Hobson was the leader among the Inupiaq people of Alaska in the 1960s. At a time when the Inupiaq people were joined with Alaska natives from around the state to fight for our native land claims. Over the past 150 years, the North Slope of Alaska, land inhabited by Inupiaq people for thousands of years, has been sold and divided to serve many interests. The United States bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. In 1923, the United States set aside 23 million acres of North Slope, an area the size of Maine, as a Naval Petroleum Reserve number 4. Today, that area is called the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, or NPRA, and is home to 4 of our villages. In 1960, the Department of Interior set aside the Arctic National Wildlife Range, which in 1980 became the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. ANWR covers an area the size of South Carolina, and it was set aside for conservation without the consent of the Kaktovik, the native people who are from that place. Alaska became a state in 1959.
How'd you get 90?
And the federal government granted the new state an entitlement to 102 million acres of land. In 1968, oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay, and the state selected the land at Prudhoe Bay over objections of native people who had inhabited the place. In 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which allows Alaska Natives to take title to millions of acres of land around the state. However, on the North Slope, the state had already selected the area around Prudhoe Bay. The federal government had already set aside the NPRA and Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. These areas were not made available for selection by native people. Because the federal and state governments had already claimed the oil and gas resources on the North Slope. The late Eben Hobson worked with our Inupiat leaders to create the borough, a home rule municipality that would give our people the ability to tax onshore oil and gas infrastructure and thereby benefit from the resources being developed in our backyard. Our ability as local government to derive some benefits from oil and gas development has, for almost 50 years, supported health clinics, schools, water and sewer infrastructure in our villages, a tribal college, and police, and emergency services. Services that are most Americans take for granted. In a speech he gave in 1976, Eben Hobson talked about a discovery by federal government of natural gas near Utkarvik, which was formerly called Barrow. The federal government had created the National Petroleum Reserve in 1923, and within the reserve, the Navy established a small research facility near Point Barrow. Exploratory drilling led to discovery of the natural gas in 1949. And a gas field was developed near the community. Natural gas was, used to heat federal buildings like the hospital, the BIA school, and the Navy buildings. The government did not allow the community of Barrow to use the gas to heat their homes. In his speech, Eben spoke about the long, frustrating 12-year struggle to get permission to hook up our homes in Barrow to natural gas mains that crisscross Barrow through our backyards. Although it sounds incredible today, the government refused to let the residents of Barrow use the natural gas that comes from our own backyard to heat our homes. It took an act of Congress in 1963 to allow the native people of Barrow to buy their own natural gas back from the federal government. The Arctic Ocean is a place where we have hunted for whales and walrus, seals for thousands of years. If someday oil and gas resources are developed in the Arctic Ocean, those offshore resources, just like onshore oil and gas resources, will come out from our backyard. The development of that resources will have an impact on our communities. It is only fair that some of the revenues from the development should be reinvested in long-term survival of our communities. Congress has already authorized revenue sharing in other federal laws. The Mineral Leasing Act authorized revenue sharing from onshore mineral development. The Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act authorizes revenue sharing from offshore oil and gas development in the Gulf. Whatever each of you as individual members of Congress may think about oil and gas development, it would be unconscionable to oppose legislation that extend offshore oil and gas revenue sharing to Alaska to provide a fair share of resource revenue to communities that are impacted. I would like to thank Senator Murkowski for her leadership on this issue. I urge members of the committee to act on this legislation. For the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.
Koinakpak, Mayor.
Chair.
Ms. Comey, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee, good morning. My name is Laura Comey, and I'm a specialist in natural resources policy at the Congressional Research Service. As requested by the committee, my testimony will focus on the revenue sharing provisions of the two bills under discussion. CRS takes no position on these bills or on other policy matters. My testimony draws on my own area of specialization, which is federal management of offshore energy, and on the input of other CRS colleagues who cover onshore energy and broader energy policy issues. I will discuss each bill in turn. S 2418 would make changes to offshore oil and gas revenue sharing in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. Title I would amend the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, which governs offshore revenue sharing with 4 Gulf-producing states, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and with the state grant program of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The bill would provide for a higher portion of the revenues to be shared with the states. It would do this first by expanding the set of leases eligible for revenue sharing. GOMESA currently applies only to leases entered into since the law's enactment in December 2006. This includes approximately 60% of active leases in the Gulf, but many of these newer leases are not producing. The bill would broaden the qualified leases to include those entered into since October 2000. Second, the bill would increase the percentage of qualified revenues shared with the states. Currently, states get 37.5% of the revenues, while 12.5% are shared with the LWCF program, and the remaining 50% are deposited in the general fund of the Treasury. S 2418 would change those percentages so that 50% of the revenues would be shared with the states and 37.5% would go to the Treasury. The 12.5% for the LWCF would remain the same. Also, currently, the revenue sharing in most of the Gulf is capped at $500 million annually for most years through fiscal year 2055. The bill would eliminate this cap. It also would exempt the state share from budget sequestration. Collectively, these changes would have the effect of increasing the portion of Gulf revenues shared with the states while decreasing the share going to the U.S. Treasury. Title II of S 2418 would establish an offshore revenue sharing program in the Alaska region, similar in many ways to GOMESA's program for the Gulf, though with some differences. Whereas current law provides for all Alaska revenues to go to the U.S. Treasury except for projects near state waters, the bill would direct that these revenues be split at 50% to the Treasury and 50% to the state and its coastal political subdivisions. The state share could be used for purposes similar to those in GOMESA, such as coastal restoration and infrastructure projects to mitigate impacts of offshore development, and also for some purposes not covered in GOMESA. The changes could have relatively limited fiscal impacts in the near term because Alaska has many fewer leases than the Gulf and generates much less revenue. Future offshore revenues in the region are uncertain and would depend on many factors. The second bill, S 2666, would make changes in Section 9 related to onshore revenue sharing from solar and wind energy siting on public lands. As agreed with the committee, CRS testimony focuses on this revenue sharing provision and does not cover other aspects of the bill. The bill would require that the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service disperse 25% of solar and wind revenues to states, 25% to counties, and the remainder to 2 programs established in the bill to facilitate permitting and promote conservation and recreational access. BLM and the Forest Service administer wind and solar projects through rights-of-way under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. Almost all the current projects are on BLM lands. The revenues from solar and wind siting include rents and fees. Currently, other than fees retained by both agencies for cost recovery, BLM rents and fees are deposited to the U.S. Treasury. Forest Service rents and fees are subject to the agency's general revenue sharing requirements, whereby 25% of average gross revenue over 7 years is shared with counties. The remainder of Forest Service revenues go to the Treasury. Under S 2666, no revenue would go to the general Treasury as the state sharing and the 2 new programs would account for 100% of the funding. This concludes my remarks. Thank you, and I look forward to responding to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Comey. Mr. Klein, welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Manchin, for allowing me to testify on the issue of revenue sharing and on the merits of the Coastal Act. Particularly, I would like to thank you, Madam Chair, and Senator Bill Cassidy for sponsoring this important legislation. Federal lands located within inland states and federal waters on the outer continental shelf produce energy that yield resources that are used for the benefit of all Americans. However, the federal government relies on the states for these activities to be successful. The passage of the Mineral Lands Leasing Act in 1920 determined that the federal government needed to share revenues derived from oil and gas production with the states if the states were going to be successful in providing these services. Under this legislation, inland producing states share 50% of revenues generated from all leases on federal land, and their allowable uses have expanded to include any governmental activity of the state. This generous revenue sharing has become extremely important to the states. In fact, according to a Department of Interior press release issued just last week, in fiscal year 2019, the federal government returned $1.1 billion to the state of New Mexico from oil and gas production on federal lands there. To be clear, we support this revenue sharing for inland producing states. However, in the mid-20th century, when federal mineral production moved offshore, no similar revenue share was provided to the coastal states. It was not until the passage of GOMESA in 2006 did the federal government provide any amount of revenue sharing for coastal states. Despite this arrangement, the 4 Gulf states have provided the same governmental services that support this activity as the onshore states. Coastal states also provided and support the vast and extensive infrastructure needed to transport this energy across the nation, including highways, ports, and pipeline corridors. All of these activities have helped generate hundreds of billions of dollars into the federal treasury. Madam Chair, I would like to draw your attention to the map just behind me here that shows the thousands of miles of pipelines that cut across our coastline and through our coastal wetlands. These pipelines are essential if federal offshore oil and gas is to get to the people, communities, and industries of America that rely on this energy. Louisiana is proud of our working coast and our contribution to the nation's energy needs. However, this important energy production for our nation comes at a cost to our state. The construction and maintenance of these pipelines has contributed to the loss of coastal wetlands, and that land loss in turn places that pipeline infrastructure at greater exposure to environmental conditions and storm surge. Today, GOMESA applies to just 5% of the total production in the Gulf of Mexico. It provides for revenue sharing only on leases since 2006. Half of that revenue produced from those leases remains with the federal treasury, and the remaining 50% is further subdivided by the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the 4 Gulf producing states, and their 42 political subdivisions. And these revenues, as Senator Cassidy mentioned, are capped at $375 million. The Coastal Act addresses this disparity by applying revenue sharing to a larger portion of the federal OCS production in the Gulf. It increases the portion of the revenue that is shared with the Gulf states to 50% rather than the current 37.5%. These changes would achieve for the GOMESA states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and for the state of Alaska, uniformity in revenue sharing with those states that are governed by the Mineral Lands Leasing Act. In Louisiana, as mandated both by federal law and more importantly by our state constitution, we have committed all GOMESA funds to the protection and restoration of our coast and to the implementation of our state's coastal master plan. Louisiana's coastal master plan is our framework for making difficult decisions. It is a tool based on the best available science and used to confront the analytical challenges of a complex coastal environment. It takes into account uncertain future environmental conditions, multiple project types, and diverse community needs. It is our guidebook for implementing meaningful restoration and protection projects. The bottom line, Madam Chair, is that we are being responsible with the dollars that are returned to us from oil and gas production. We are reinvesting these dollars back into our coast and building projects that protect our homes, our communities, our businesses, our environment, our way of life, and the very infrastructure that continues to help fuel this nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Mr. Luthi, welcome.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the kind introduction of Senator Barrasso, but it did make me realize that when I probably first started my dealings with your committee, I was much taller and my hair was much browner. But it's always good to be here. Good morning, Madam Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee. I'm Randall Luthi, Chief Energy Advisor for Governor Gordon, and on behalf of the governor, thank you for the opportunity for me to meet with you and discuss with you some of my favorite things, which are Wyoming, energy, and revenue sharing. Governor Gordon sends his best regards, and he is appreciative of the committee's efforts to work with the states. Wyoming is an energy-producing state. Wyoming ranks third in total energy production. It ranks eighth in both oil and natural gas production. The oil and gas industry is the single largest economic driver in the state, with a contribution of more than $5 billion to the annual GDP and supplies over 46,000 jobs. Wyoming is the #1 producer of coal, supplying approximately 40% of the nation's coal supply, employs over 5,000 people, and provides 11% of the nation's electricity. Now, while this isn't a topic of today's hearing, coal should remain an important part of that energy mix. And we can do that through CO2 reducing technologies such as carbon capture. On the non-traditional side, Wyoming has several wind farms and a commercial scale solar installation. Plans are underway to build one of the largest wind farms in the world in southern Wyoming. In total, Wyoming exports 300 trillion BTUs of energy every year. Now, the preferred energy fuel source for electricity is changing. And while I am concerned that the Black Friday-like stampede towards non-traditional sources will likely actually result in blackout Fridays, the future is clear. There's going to be more solar and wind. Recently, a large utility company revealed its resource plan, which included early and untimely closure of Wyoming coal-fired plants. The replacement power will be 1,800 megawatts of solar and about 2,000 megawatts of wind, most of which will be built in Wyoming. Governor Gordon believes that a broad array of energy resources is the best guarantee for a consistent, reliable, and affordable electricity delivery system. We plan to continue our legacy as an energy leader and enjoy a good neighbor relationship with the federal government. The Public Lands and Renewable Energy Development Act is a good base upon which to maintain and enhance that good neighbor relationship. Thank you, Senators McSally. Thank you, Senator Heinrich, for introducing the bill. We do have a few minor suggestions. We suggest that the language be clarified, that when the Secretary determines the most appropriate areas, that come only after good faith consultation with the states. Said consultation should be more than just a check of the box function, and of course, preferably through the office of the governor. Grandfathering projects that are not completed but have based their business model on current fees and taxes is also very important. We appreciate the bill's efforts to do so. While solar and wind projects are considered renewable, the habitat impacts are not removed. There are real costs to state and local governments. Per megawatt, their footprint is far larger than coal, gas, or nuclear powered plants. Solar installations result in a single use of large swaths of land. Governor Gordon recognizes that roughnecks, engineers, hunters, four-wheel enthusiasts, and true environmentalists are often the same person, or at least in the same family. Multiple uses of public land has great support in Wyoming. At the end of their life, decommissioning of renewable energy projects often result in non-usable blades being taken to landfills and long periods of attempted regrowth and disposal issues of batteries. Over the life of the projects, the job and tax revenue connected with these projects do not compare with the number of jobs and tax available through traditional sources of energy. Thus, the revenue sharing portions of the bill is very key. Wyoming's not new to revenue sharing. The current revenue sharing is 48%, which I very subtly point out should be 50%. Subtle, let me underline subtle there. And it was actually introduced by former Senator Cliff Hansen. New Mexico and Wyoming are usually the largest recipients. New Mexico received $1 billion recently, and Wyoming over $640 million. Something's a little wrong with that picture, but we can talk about that another time. The committee should consider a revenue sharing formula that's identical to the current oil and gas formula, or could do so. The earmarking of 35% of the fund for habitat promotion for hunting and fishing is great. We suggest suggests that the best distribution mechanism would be directly to local and state organizations. If a new federal program is established, it's very likely those funds will not only miss the bullseye, but the entire target of what works. As an example, the Wyoming Wildlife Trust Fund's been in existence for 15 years. It does projects like underpasses and overpasses over highways so wildlife is able to avoid traffic altogether. It also provides revenue sharing with other programs in cooperation with Wyoming landowners and other landowners. Existing programs such as Partners for Fish and Wildlife also have a good record of working with the states, and they are usually underfunded. They should be considered in the distribution scheme. So in addition, any development and land disturbance has unintended consequences, and generally that refers to the introduction of invasive species. So it's important to allow maximum flexibility, whatever the distribution plan, to allow funds to the local solutions such as control of invasive species. In summary, Governor Gordon generally is supportive of the proposed legislation and looks forward to working with all of you as it goes forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Luthi. Thank you all for your comments this morning and your input to this very important conversation. Mayor Brower, I so appreciate you giving the detail of the history that we have seen in Alaska and most particularly up in our North Slope with the federal ownership of lands and how those lands, whether it was within NPRA or over on the eastern side in the wildlife refuge area, where effectively the federal government came in without much discussion to those that have lived there for generations, for thousands of years, and determined that these federal lands would be available for the federal government with no sharing with the people within the region. So as you have pointed out, this measure that we have in front of us today is in part to help address that lack of parity, that lack of sharing, and to recognize some of the challenges that a borough like the North Slope Borough faces. You have shared with us by way of comparison the size that you're dealing with. 8 villages across an area of 600 miles. The National Petroleum Reserve, the size of the state of Maine. The 1002 area within Anwar, or excuse me, the Anwar area, the size of the state of California. And so when you think about how services are provided, each one of those 8 communities is an isolated community. There is no road, as we all know, connecting the 8 so that you have any level of efficiencies. So everything from search and rescue to the power generation within the communities, the transportation facilities, small airstrips, everything has to be unique and really self-contained. These are truly islanded communities, and as such, being in the part of the state, the part of the country that they are, very, very expensive. You've outlined very briefly some of the benefits that revenue sharing can help provide, everything from operation to from clinics to schools to water and sewer to police and public safety to tribal college to emergency services. Can you share some of the threats that you are seeing from an infrastructure perspective across the borough due to the coastal and erosion issues that you effectively have to respond to because they're threatening the people within the communities, and share with us how the borough deals with the cost of providing for these infrastructure upgrades or whatever may be needed to help facilitate these communities to remain safe in their homes.
Thank you, Chairperson Koski. I think these are very important subjects to cover, as you've identified in the oral comments and in the written comments provided. The areas of, I could immediately just start communicating on is the coastal erosion that's really prevalent in our coastal communities, Point Hope, Wainwright, Barrow, Kaktovik. And we're losing land to the ocean because of the continuous wave action, coastal erosion. The less ice presence is causing more coastal erosion in an accelerated pace. The funds that the borough provides for this measures to try and protect the communities is very costly, in the millions of dollars that we provide to these communities to build up a small seawall for the time that it's been impacted from the fall storms. We have a seawall that we built out of these super sacks, or that's what we identify them as we learned them in the use by the industry to build their islands, and filling them with gravel to retain the gravel and minimizing the effect of coastal erosion to several of our villages. So these are things that, and extracting gravel to fill in those sacks is very costly, and placing these sacks in areas of importance. We've had a military base up in Utrecht. The Naval Arctic Research Lab had a station there and based out of several miles out of the community. And it had a large landfill that it had developed to put its waste into this landfill over time. Debris of all sorts and hazardous waste in a sense that were placed in this landfill. Now that landfill is near an encroachment of the coastal erosion constantly getting closer. Madam Chair, I was in your office several years ago about the observations that we're dealing with in terms of that. If that ever gets exposed and breaches that site, there's contamination to the Arctic Ocean, and significant issues will arise from that breach of that landfill site. And it's a military site. It's very important that get mentioned, but we do not quite have the resources to identify to help minimize that coastal erosion impact that's all along down our North Slope coastline.
Well, Mayor,
Sorry.
my time is expired, but what you're speaking to is a very, very present threat. This is not something that is could be expected decades from now.
Yeah.
But the impact to the waste site, what we've seen with the threat to the water and sewer infrastructure
Yes.
there in Utqiagvik. My ranking member here, Senator Manchin, was with me in Kaktovik, knows that airstrip is not the original strip. This is a new runway that has had to be built because of the coastal erosion there. So I'll come back for a second round and we'll have further discussion on this, but these are very important to put on the record. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you all again. This question would probably be Mr. Gould, and maybe Ms. Comey could speak on this, and then I have other questions too. But both the Mineral Leasing Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act were put in place to establish leasing systems for resource extraction on our federal managed public lands. Both bills establish royalties and other requirements to ensure our public lands are not a total free-for-all. And these resources can be made available at times of national need. I understand all of that. My question would be, with that in mind, if you all could speak to what the reasoning was for giving the states a 50% share in the Mineral Leasing Act compared to the 37.5% for Go Mesa. As a public policy, you might be able to tell me a little more about that.
I was not privy to those discussions, obviously, and but we do at Honor is we ensure that whatever that law says, we will collect and disperse appropriately according to those laws. The underlying reasons for why those laws were passed or how that came about, that's not something that we are involved in or were involved in.
Do you have any comment on the fairness of that or the inequality or equality of that?
I don't have any comment on that. No, not from my position as Director of Honor.
Gotcha. Ms. Conway, Ms. Comey.
So, Senator, the question about the Mineral Leasing Act would probably be better for some of my colleagues who cover the onshore energy side to address. In terms of GOMESA's provisions for the 37.5% revenue share, as is the case today, some of the issues that were debated at that time are some of the ones that we've talked about. On the one hand, the environmental impacts to coastal states of hosting offshore development and the investments that they make in infrastructure. On the other hand, the position of some that the fact that the waters are not in the state would make a difference in terms of the type of revenue sharing that might occur.
Okay. Mr. Klein, you might be able to answer this one for me. I understand the Coastal Master Plan was created to help restore coastlines in your state through coordinating. I've spent some time in your state and I enjoy it very much. Under the Louisiana State Constitution, all the funds the state receives under GOMESA go towards the Coastal Master Plan, I understand. Are GOMESA funds the only federal funds that are going towards projects under the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, or do you all have state funds matching it, or how do you handle that?
Yes, sir. So currently, the only recurring source of revenue that we receive from the federal government comes from the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. We do have state funds, state revenues that are also derived from mineral production on state lands and state water bottoms, as well as the last 3 years, the state of Louisiana has run budget surpluses, and the governor has allocated state dollars to the Coastal Trust Fund for hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects across our coast.
Is there a certain amount on an annual basis, like your GOMESA fund, all goes towards that? I understand. But does the state match up or try to match up each year as much as possible, or just what they have available?
As much as we can, yes, sir. Historically, that's typically about $35 million per year, depending on the production on state land and state water bottoms. But as I mentioned, in addition to the mineral revenues derived on state lands and state water bottoms, we have last year, Governor Edwards allocated an additional $55 million in state dollars. And this year, we have been asked to put together a proposal of up to $120 million for hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects across our coast.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Gould, I'm concerned about the unnecessary venting and flaring. I think you heard me in my opening statement of methane from oil and gas operations on public lands. And as I've said, these are public resources, and when it's vented or flared, the taxpayers lose out, and so doesn't the environment. Pound for pound, the comparative impact of methane is more than 25 times greater than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. So what steps are the Department of Interior taking to reduce the unnecessary flaring?
So from the environmental impacts, I can't speak to that. That would be done by the Bureau of Land Management when they work with the companies
Well, you
on
know
that.
it's not healthy, right? I mean, just common sense says it's not healthy.
Of course.
Okay.
And the revenue part of it, though, is something that we do work closely with the Bureau of Land Management on. And we work with them to do analysis of whether or not it's avoidably lost or not.
Do you have any estimation of how much we're losing, how much is being flared on federal lands?
Right now, we don't, but we are working closely with the Bureau of Land Management to get those numbers so that we can accurately collect it.
Could you get that? That doesn't seem like a hard number to get, because you know how much production, we know how much flaring based on production, so that wouldn't be hard to calculate.
We're working with them on those numbers. They have to go through and see what is avoidable or not in the production process. So those numbers have to be backed out.
What time frame do you think maybe we could get those answers?
We are working with them right now, and we're hoping to have those answers here soon.
Okay, well, let's say by the end of the month.
I'll work with BLM to see what we can do about
Okay,
getting
I'll have
those numbers.
one of my staff members work directly with you, sir.
We'd be happy to
Thank
work
you.
with the committee on that.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Klein, I'll be speaking with you. First, again, obviously we are in the Senate and we always want to stick up for our home state. And so everybody says that your state's problems are unique and of national significance. But in this case, I think I'm being more than a homer. I think I'm actually got something to say to that. And you can give chapter and verse, but as I understand, we've lost land in Louisiana relative sea level rise greater than the entire state of Delaware. I think I also know the Central Gulf has the greatest amount of elevation loss relative sea level rise in the entire nation. So Grand Isle has lost, for example, a barrier island off our coast has lost, I think, is it 9 feet or 6 feet of elevation?
Approximately 8 feet, somewhere in between there. Yes, sir.
Yes, 8 feet. Whereas the Florida coastline in Pensacola has been in the order of inches. Now, this is in part, large measure, because of the leveeing of the Mississippi River after the 1927 flood.
Yeah.
And what's John's last name? The guy that wrote Rising Tide.
John Barry.
John Barry. I hate to say that this week with West Plain, Alabama, but about how that was done for the benefit of inland ports. Now, all that said, let me also compliment you, because when Sheldon Whitehouse, our colleague from Rhode Island, came down, he said that our coastal master plan was the best developed of any state in the nation. So I know that's been going under 3 administrations at least, but just congratulations to the state. Now, all that to say, let's establish that this is not just of local or regional significance, but also of national. Can you tell us what national energy assets would be affected should we continue to have unabated coastal loss?
First of all, Senator, go Tigers. Big game this weekend. Senator, whenever we talk about the national economic assets that are housed in coastal Louisiana, I always like to start with Port Fourchon. Port Fourchon is on the front lines of coastal erosion and land loss in our state. It is a port that services 90% of the oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico. You also have the Louisiana offshore oil port, which transports 70% of the oil produced in the Gulf of Mexico. You have 2 sites in coastal Louisiana, which serve as our strategic housing for our strategic petroleum reserves, which house hundreds of millions of barrels of oil for emergency situations in our coast, across our country. Our LNG facilities rank 4th in the entire globe. We have major refineries across coastal Louisiana that refine the material that is produced off of our coast.
And by the way, if you include the coastal area and the Mississippi River, I would guess that in the United States, there's no higher concentration of those making the refined plastics and petroleum products that we need to create jobs and power a modern economy.
That is exactly right, Senator.
Yes. And that is leaving off, if you will, I think after Alaska, we have the greatest amount of seafood production in the United States as well. And then let me ask you this, because you'll know this. What is the general flood elevation in the region of our state where these energy assets and seafood industries are located?
So flood elevations vary across our coast, Senator, but typically the flood elevation across coastal Louisiana is just above 5 feet above sea level. Now, there are areas across our coast, where, for example, the city of New Orleans, that is probably close to 5 feet below sea level. And so the risk as a result of those elevations is that our coastal communities, if we experience a hurricane similar to the one of Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Rita, our coastal communities could see a storm surge of anywhere from 1 to 15 feet.
Now, if you rebuild coastline and you have those wetlands, if you will, as a bumper against that Cat 4 hurricane coming on shore.
Yes, sir.
How does that help diminish the impact of that hurricane?
So coastal restoration and hurricane protection go hand in hand. When you restore the natural environment, your natural buffer, your natural wetlands and your marshlands and your ecosystems, you are taking the pressure off of your inland hurricane protection systems. So when we're restoring our environment, that is really our first line of defense in coastal Louisiana.
I remember some statistic for every mile of coastline, you take a Cat 4 down to a Cat 3.
Well, for every acre of wetland that you create or build, you knock down a storm surge by a certain percentage.
Now, let me ask as well, folks may be not aware, but I'm aware, 3 of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage are in South Louisiana. So for the farmer in Iowa to get his goods to the rest of the world, then at a competitive price, it is the Port of New Orleans, the Port of South Louisiana, et cetera, that allows that to happen.
Yes, sir. 5 of the top 15 ports are housed in coastal Louisiana. 5
of the top 15. Now, I may have to ask Senator Landrieu to whisper into your ear, but I think we spent about $20 billion on Katrina, right?
I would say well north of 20 billion. In the government response to Hurricane Katrina was well over, I think, $100 billion in total response. Now, the hurricane protection system that was built around the greater New Orleans area was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $14 billion that was invested in that area responding to that disaster.
So I'm out of time, but let's just say that if we spend 100 billion in response, but instead we can have enhanced restoration, which in turn will decrease the potential need for another 100 billion, so that goods from Iowa can get around the world and that oil and gas can get from wherever to wherever. That would be a wise, penny-wise investment. Thank you, Mr. Klein. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It occurs to me in your conversation with the mayor, and then obviously with respect to Louisiana as well, I had a chance to look at the coastal erosion in Kaktovik, and that's a fairly new dynamic. And in all of this, I think it bears considering the very real climate impacts, because sea level rise is accelerating. When you overlay the impacts that the lack of ice has had on that coastal erosion, this is going to continue to accelerate. And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with not only communities on the coast, but as the mayor said, a legacy of all sorts of hazardous materials that currently sit in low-lying areas, all sorts of infrastructure associated with energy production that are in low-lying areas. And that's going to cost an enormous amount of money, and it's going to take an enormous amount of creativity. Mr. Gould, you get the unfortunate, you're the unfortunate target of my questions because we don't have a witness from the BLM here today. So you're the best thing we've got from DOI. The BLM's written testimony expresses opposition to the revenue sharing portion of the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act because of, quote, concerns with the potential long-term costs of diverting those from the Treasury. Now, the cost of that, I estimate, based on recent numbers, to be about $22 million per year. Yet in your testimony on the Coastal Act, you did not express concern about the long-term costs of greater revenue sharing of offshore oil and gas revenues. Do you know what the projected long-term costs are for the Coastal Act? And this is not a commentary on whether we should do it or not do it. I think it's addressing some very real concerns, but do you know what it costs?
I do not have those numbers, and those numbers are numbers that are done with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So they do the long-term estimates. They look at the economic impacts.
Do you know enough to know whether they would be greater than or less than the 22 million per year?
They'd be greater than that.
Yeah, my estimate is that,
Again, we don't know that.
I guarantee it. We need to get all these things scored, but I'm estimating that at roughly $1 billion a year. So 10 billion over the course of a 10-year budget window. Why is the administration not concerned about those costs?
At this point, I think the BLM written testimony expressed their concerns. And then from Honor's perspective, what we do is we take what you all feel is the best way to disperse revenue, and then we make sure that we collect every dollar due and then disperse it according to the law.
Right. Well, I only bring that up because I think that appears to me to also speak to the issue of fairness that Senator Cassidy has brought up. I'd love to ask you some more questions about why the BLM has been so slow to move forward on development. We've had this Smart from the Start program. Maybe Senator Cortez Masto can address some of this because Nevada seems to be the only place where we've really seen some progress in terms of those areas of roughly 700,000 acres that were designated as high potential, lower impact zones for renewable energy development. We've seen some good progress in Nevada. We have not seen that kind of progress in other Western states. And I would love to know from the BLM why. And then I would just make the point, as you know, I think a number of people have referenced how New Mexico is currently going through quite an increase in production, and you see that in the revenues flowing. We're also seeing an enormous issue with methane, and it is very frustrating for me to see the Department of Interior roll back its methane rule when NASA documented the practically state-sized cloud of methane over the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. So if we're going to produce these energy resources, we have a public health responsibility to the communities where they are produced. And it is very frustrating for me to see when we've had states, including Wyoming, including Colorado, that have had to step up and fill that vacuum because the Department of Interior hasn't done it, to see those rules rolled back. And I will tell you that as a result, New Mexico is in the process of moving forward on rules because the department has simply not met their responsibility to public health.
Senator Heinrich, thank you. Senator McSally.
Thank you, Chairwoman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, for holding this hearing today, in part to talk about my bill with Senator Manchin, the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act. This is a really important bill for Arizona. Renewable energy, particularly solar, is an incredible opportunity for Arizona. As I've said before, we have an abundance of two things, sunshine and open space. But in a state where nearly 70% of our land is controlled by the federal government, burdensome federal permitting processes and not competitive prices severely restrict our renewable energy potential. So our bipartisan bill institutes this common sense improvement to the permitting process to expedite the approval of solar, wind, and geothermal projects on public land parcels where the type of development makes sense from an environmental and economic perspective. Most important, though, is the bill ensures states and counties with massive federal footprints receive a fair share of the revenue from the renewable energy produced on the public land surrounding their communities. A portion of the revenue will be dedicated to conservation activities, which will improve wildlife habitats and public land access for outdoor recreation. So there's multitude of benefits that our bill delivers, and we brought together a very diverse coalition of support from industry, state and local governments, and environmental and recreation stakeholders. I have a list of nearly 50 endorsements this bill has earned from these organizations, and I would like to submit this list and several letters of support into the record. Great, thank you. Mr. Luthi, I appreciate you communicating overall general support for the idea of our bill. Wyoming, I think, shares similar challenges, not quite 70%. I think you're more like 48% or so federal land in Wyoming. So a large federal footprint can, present the same challenges for you. So can you share how you think the revenue sharing provisions of our bill can help local governments and ultimately benefit residents of states like yours and ours?
Madam Chairman, Senator McSally, thank you for that opportunity. And yes, Wyoming is already well acquainted with revenue sharing on the other energy types of resources. And currently, if you do just some rough calculation of our general budget, those resources directly from shared revenue resources are about almost 20% of the total state budget. So that's a big chunk. Over 50% of the state's budget is connected with K through 12 education. So any revenue sharing that allows to come back either to the state or directly to the counties or cities is going to be used, I think, just for necessary programs. Because as you mentioned, projects do have impacts. They have economic benefits, but they also do have impacts. And I think on the particulars I mentioned in my testimony, renewables as a rule has impacts upfront. They also have construction costs, which actually, during construction, you have some local benefits.
Yep.
But once that construction is gone, that's pretty much it, both for the tax base and the overall economic benefit. So, and particularly on the area of wind and solar, revenue sharing would be particularly helpful to the local communities.
Got it. Thanks. So you think in areas like K through 12, it really could have an impact. And keep in mind, this revenue sharing is in addition to the payment in lieu of taxes, which these local communities are also really counting on.
Madam Chairman, Senator McSally, I would say if Arizona follows a similar distribution as Wyoming does, which is actually left up to the legislature as a rule, K through 12 just takes the lion's share of almost any state budget. So it's definitely going to go to help benefit education.
Well, that's great to hear. Thanks for your perspective on that. You also mentioned in your testimony that the energy worker, the sportsman, the environmentalist, they're often in the same person or the same household. So you make a good point that we do have shared values. I think these Venn diagrams overlap. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So do you see, actually how our bill could help Western states strike that balance between between, conservation and economic opportunity and access and all those values that you shared are often summed up in the same person.
Madam Chairman, Senator McSally, absolutely. And I think where you make the difference is, nationally, these kind of issues become very polarized. They're not polarized at the local level. Because again, it's often the very same person that works at a company and also wants to go fishing after work, hunting after work, take the four-wheeler. They appreciate the ability to have federal lands that truly are multiple use.
That's great. I agree with you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time. You bet.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you to the chairwoman and ranking member for bringing these bills forward. Mr. Gould, let me ask you very quickly about S2666, the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act. It sets a renewable energy production goal for the Department of the Interior to permit 25 gigawatts of renewable energy on public lands by 2025. This year, Nevada has taken steps to increase its own renewable energy goals by increasing its renewable portfolio standard to 50% by 2030. With more than 80% of the land in Nevada being federally managed, there will need to be more collaboration and work between stakeholders, industry, and the BLM in order to meet this ambitious goal. Many in Nevada have said that they have a good working relationship with local BLM offices, but admit, and I think this comes to some of the conversation my colleague Senator Heinrich from New Mexico was talking about, but what I hear is that BLM lacks staff resources, and that has had an impact on renewable energy development in Nevada alone. So I guess my question to you is, the Department of the Interior equipped with the necessary staff in its state and national offices to adequately address and process an influx of renewable energy project proposals?
Senator, thank you for that question. And from the department's perspective, I think we would be very happy to work with you in the committee to make sure that the BLM has those discussions that are needed to have with the Congress in terms of making those resources available if those resources are needed. So I think from my perspective at Honor, we can't really answer questions related to the resources of BLM, but I know that the department would be happy to work with the committee.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the position you're in as well. So thank you, and I look forward to that. I think for purposes of our conversation, particularly knowing that Nevada works with the BLM on a regular basis, I think there is a resource issue that we are willing to work with you on to address for not just purposes of Nevada, but across the other states as well, and for that benefit. Let me jump back to Mr. Luthi. In your testimony, you also expressed support for provisions in S2666, but make some recommendations to improve the bill. Your recommendations include more consultation and cooperation between the federal government and the office of the governor in a given state to reduce conflicts. I am a big supporter of that. And let me just ask you this. Without the appropriate consultation among local and state stakeholders and the federal government, what obstacles might projects on public lands in Wyoming experience?
Madam Chairman, Senator Cortez Masto, I'm somewhat speculating, but again, if you have full consultation from top to bottom, federal government, states, local communities, what's going to helpfully avoid are those local issues that are important and things that you don't often see from the 30,000-foot level. That might be a migration corridor for antelope or deer. It might be a specific use for four-wheelers that most people wouldn't know about, but is very important to the local community. And it just gives the opportunity for the local community to have a say in what they think is important as we work with the federal government. Nevada, even more so than Wyoming, has a lot of public land, meaning owned by the federal land, by the government. So it becomes just so important to be a good neighbor. You've got to be able to talk across the fence line and understand where everyone is coming from.
And I appreciate that, because coming from a Western state as well, I think it's important. Listen, the federal employees live in our states. Hopefully, and or come in and have an impact. And we want to develop good relations with them. And hopefully that they are always consulting and working with local and state government on issues that impact the individual states. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for the hearing today. Thank you, all of you, for being here.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hirono.
Aloha to Senator Landrieu. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all the testifiers. I was noting your response, Mr. Luthi, to Senator Cortez Masto's questions, and I'm really glad to know that in Wyoming you do talk with all of the affected entities so that you are able to make good decisions, and I would expect and hope that that's what all of the states do. This is a question for Mr. Klein. Both Louisiana and Hawaii are suffering from climate change and have considered management retreat plans in the face of the loss of land due to sea level rise and more intense storms caused by climate change. According to a 2017 Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report, 3.2 feet of sea level rise will impact 6,500 homes and businesses, displace 20,000 residents, and cause $13 billion in property damage and losses. The estimate does not include damage to Hawaii's critical infrastructure. Because if you've ever been to Waikiki, have you?
No, ma'am.
It's one of the places that will be underwater. Yeah, it's a big part of our revenue generation. So, in your testimony, you describe how Senator Cassidy's bill would use federal revenues from offshore oil and gas revenues to help Louisiana, but Hawaii, Maine, and many other states will get no money from this bill, even though they are already dealing with sea level rise. How do you propose the United States fund coastal resilience without effectively subsidizing the oil and gas emissions that help cause the sea level rise and ocean acidification in the first place?
So thank you for the question, Senator. First of all, I think I would like for the committee to know that the Coastal Master Plan absolutely takes into account climate change and utilizes the best available science. So I believe our coastlines have a lot of similarities between the two and similar sea level rise projections for coastal Louisiana as your state. Oil and gas exploration in our state is a part of our economy, and we have found a way to balance living with oil and gas production, but also addressing the impacts of that production on our coast. And so what we're saying is, and why we're such proponents of this legislation is, if we're going to support that activity that is occurring off of our coast, and if our coastline is providing access to those oil and gas revenues off of the Gulf of Mexico, then those dollars ought to be reinvested into our coastline to protect our communities, to protect our businesses, our way of life, and to sustain the very infrastructure that allows for that production to take place to begin with.
Interrupting, but what's going on with the oil and gas activities is causing sea level rise in places like Hawaii. So what do we get for, what kind of help can we get, should we get? I mean, obviously, I think that we should get some of this help, even if we're not right there in the Gulf.
Senator, I would offer to you that you could go after the other 50% that goes into the federal treasury to help implement restoration projects in your state that could address the impacts of climate change. And so the reason why we're here today, Senator, is that our state does suffer impacts due to oil and gas exploration.
Yes.
And that's why we feel that we deserve a larger share of revenues that are coming from our coast and reinvesting them in our coast to address those issues.
You're obviously advocating for Louisiana, and that's fine and good. And I think what this committee needs to do is to look at the impact of climate change and sea level rise affecting all of the states, including states like Hawaii. And you mentioned the 50% of the revenues. I have absolutely no idea how much of that would go to places like Hawaii and other states similarly situated. So I would want to look at that, Madam Chair, and make sure that we have a fair allocation. Well, another question for you. I mean, you do know that Louisiana's coastal loss has been exacerbated. You just talked about that now by offshore oil and gas development. If oil and gas development has damaged coasts of Louisiana and other states, shouldn't the companies that made money from extracting oil and gas pay more to help restore the coast? I mean, why should the American people pay to offset the oil and gas companies' impacts? Because there's the argument that there should be additional federal revenues to the Gulf states.
So, Senator, I would agree that oil and gas exploration is a contributing factor of land loss in our state. However, it is not the overwhelming driver of land loss in coastal Louisiana. There are other factors at play that are contributing to that land loss. And our Governor John Bel Edwards, has taken the position to pursue some of these oil and gas companies for the damage that they have done to our coast and to hold them responsible for some of that damage.
Well, we probably should do more. Madam Chair, I just want to shout out and thank Ms. Comey for to you and your colleagues at the Congressional Research Office for the high quality of research that you provide to us. Mahalo to you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, could I just, at the discretion of Senator Cantwell, just make a 30-second
Go ahead,
clarification? Thank you, Senator Cantwell. By raising the cap under our bill, there'd be more money going to the Land Water Conservation Fund. And so Hawaii would directly benefit. I'm also working with Senator Whitehouse on a revenue sharing bill related to wind energy, because we also think that there should be an incentive for states to do that. And I believe Hawaii would benefit from that. And by the way, as we're speaking of the equity between the 50% that goes for onshore federal tax and 50% that goes for offshore, it may be that the senator from Hawaii would want to look at that as a way to generate more dollars coming more directly to Hawaii. And lastly, I'll say the environmental standards used by our companies to develop oil and gas in the Gulf exceed by far that in developing countries. And so since there's clearly a demand for fossil fuel for things like plastics, that would, I'd rather be done where there's the higher environmental standards of our nation as opposed to those of, say, a country like Nigeria. But anyway, thank you for your...
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cantwell, would you like to proceed, or do you need a couple minutes? I'll just ask a quick one here, give you a few minutes to formulate your thoughts, but it kind of follows on this discussion between Senator Hirono and the points that Senator Cassidy has just raised. And I noted in my opening statement that since the 1990s, nearly all revenue credited annually to LWCF has been from the OCS receipts. And I think, and LWCF also gets additional mandatory appropriations under GOMESA, and I think we saw that in Senator Cassidy's chart that he had up there. But I guess the question, and it may be directed to you, Ms. Comey, and maybe you, Mr. Gould, but some have suggested that we need to either dramatically restrict or even eliminate fossil fuel production in federal areas. I know several of the individuals that are in the running for the presidency right now have said, look, first thing that they would do if elected is to completely eliminate fossil fuel production on federal lands. Tell me what happens then to programs like the Reclamation Fund or Land and Water Conservation Fund, because right now it is a correct statement, is it not, that they are getting their funding that comes to LWCF to help with whether it is federal land acquisitions or whether it is stateside improvements, is coming from the offshore OCS receipts. Is that, am I accurately stating that? Mr. Gould?
Yes, thank you for the question, Madam Chair. That's an accurate statement. The 900 million that goes into the fund, and then the additional 125 million that goes in from the GOMESA funds comes directly from the offshore. A very small percentage comes from motorboat fees and some federal land acquisition, but that's a very small percentage. Over 850 million is deposited from the revenues that Honor receives from the oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico, and the full 125 million comes from that same fund.
So there's been some discussion around here. Last year, we made permanent the authorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That was something that many of us thought was an important thing to do in terms of permanent authorization. Now the discussion is mandatory funding for LWCF. But if you don't have these OCS receipts, how do you meet that now mandatory requirement?
That's another good question. And again, it would have to be from some other place within the Treasury would have to then be appropriated funds for that mandatory part of the process.
Ms.
And
Comey,
Ms.
any
Comey.
further comments on that?
No, that seems correct. As Mr. Gould said, the money currently for the LWCF comes almost entirely on both the mandatory state program side and the money coming in, the almost 900 million under the LWCF Act. That's almost all from offshore revenues. There are these other two sources, couple of sources for the main LWCF funding, but they have not been sufficient to provide more than a very small fraction.
So then when those who are not in they're not part of the GOMESA states, they're not producing states on the offshore, when they question whether or not there's any benefit that comes to them, it is a fair and accurate statement to say that with the LWCF funds that come and go out to all 50 states, that all 50 states enjoy the benefit from those receipts that are then made part of the LWCF distribution.
That's correct.
Okay. Senator Cantwell, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on that point, I'm sure you recognized our former colleague here in the audience who's played such a big role, but want to just thank her for her continued long-time support of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Was always a very supportive member on those issues. Mr. Klein, I think, and Mr. Gould, I have a few questions. One, anytime we're talking about expanding offshore drilling, I'm reminded of those horrible pictures we saw from the Deepwater Horizon blowout preventer and the impact that it's had. There's a study that was released in August by Louisiana University Marine Consortium. And so I'm not sure all the people that were involved in that, but they found that decomposing oil from the 2010 spill were mimicking having problems with crustaceans. And unfortunately, it is showing lots of problems in those crab and shelling issues and parasites. So are you familiar with this study and its impacts on marine life?
I am not, Senator, to be honest. I'm not familiar with this study. Do you know what year it was issued?
Recently. It says August, so we will get that to you. But I think part of the issue here is the unbelievable impacts that are still there related to oil. I know the chair knows this well because I've been with her up to Alaska, and there are certain species that are still being impacted by the Exxon Valdez. So these are long-term impacts, and we definitely want to make sure that we understand them as we discuss these issues. Secondly, Mr. Gould, the Politico had a story about the Department of Interior emails showed the department considering using a regulatory loophole to free oil and gas companies from drilling standards created after the Deepwater spill. This was a big concern to me as it related to blowout preventers and the standards by which we wanted to make sure we're there in the future on those kinds of hazards. Career employees reportedly balked at being told by trying to raise these questions. So are you familiar with that incident, and how do we protect the safety of our system and stop rolling back some of the provisions that Congress, in very bipartisan effort, put in place after this accident?
Thank you for that question. And no, I'm not familiar with those emails. We don't deal with the safety side. The Office of Natural Resource Revenue deals with the revenue side.
Okay, I have a feeling you were sent here because you could answer the question that way. So I get that you aren't the person in charge, but these issues and rolling back provisions that, again, were just so necessary after the neglect. We just don't think the administration is going in the right direction here, and we're going to continue to voice our concerns, particularly as it relates to then moving forward. If we're going to have an administration that is going to roll back safety procedures, then no, we're not going to be for expanding these ideas, and we definitely need to understand the science. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your comments this morning, the testimony that you have provided, and the insight. Certainly for those of you who come from producing areas, as you do, Mayor Brower, as you do, Mr. Klein, and certainly as you do, Mr. Luthi, different areas, whether it's offshore or onshore, a recognition that our federal lands have much to offer us. I think we recognize that. We also recognize the incumbent responsibility that we have to make sure that as we gain the benefit from these lands, we do so wisely with solid stewardship. That is an important part of our responsibility as well. But I think you have helped us start this conversation publicly about how we can ensure that the benefits that we receive from these lands and waters are shared fairly, and that those benefits then are utilized, whether it is, as Mayor Brower has noted, to help with infrastructure that is threatened by erosion, or the resources necessary to provide for search and rescue in an incredibly challenging landscape. Or as Mr. Klein has noted, the impacts that the state of Louisiana and other Gulf states are seeing. It is very real and very challenging, and a day-to-day reminder that while we access these extraordinary resources that we want and need and benefit from as a nation, there is a cost to that. And how we are able to balance that, how we are able to ensure that those who are providing so much for the good of the country do not do so at greater sacrifice. And so these are issues that need to be advanced in a conversation that is respectful of where one another comes from. And I think you see on this committee, we've got our Westerners, and we've got our Easterners, and we've got our far Westerners that are out on an island in the surrounded by the great ocean out there. So how we are able to engage in these discussions is very, very important, and know that we will continue in this dialogue going forward. So I appreciate the members of the panel being with us, the members of the committee being with us. I will note that votes have started, so we'll go over and attend to those. But thank you all for being here today and for traveling some distances. We stand adjourned. Mayor, thank you for being here.
Yes.
When did you get in?
Yesterday evening.
So you're like called the Nile Nighter on me. Your voice here is so.
Really, it's some time to do this afternoon, but
Oh,
that's
okay.
fine too.
Are we?
See you 12:30.
Right, that's it. Yeah. Oh, I guess it's not. Okay, all right. Well, then I'll just come back.
Okay. You back again.
Yeah.
Our schedule's wide
It may be that you have to.
Whatever.
They'll be.
We'll go to the office and we'll further instructions.
All right.
You don't need to worry.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. See you over there. Senator. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. See you. All right. Yes. I got to go for a vote, so
We'll be lightning fast. Bobby, do you want to go first? What are your further actions?
Good to see you guys. It's been a while.
Yeah, thank you for coming in. It's been great.
Sure. Yes. This is my 38 years now. So, yeah, I think I'm going to take a couple of years off. It's been a fun run. Yeah. When's your last day? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. I think this is a great
We have a tendency around here to do big packages, but we're looking forward to the next markup being a substantial markup.
And there's bipartisan buy-in there.
What we do in this committee is we work pretty hard to make sure that we've worked through the issues so that you don't have a lot of dissension. Usually we've worked them through, so oftentimes not even need for very many amendments because we worked through some of the bumps that had been presented. So I'm feeling pretty good about where we are.
Given that kind of harmonious action, I mean, how do you feel like it will fare after it leaves this committee, especially given?
I'm always optimistic about our energy bills because I think we put good process behind them. We really work hard to make sure that people are in a good place by the time we get to committee.
You spoke to the leader about this?
Majority leader, yeah. I keep telling him, I said, we're gonna give you a nice package with a bow on it.
And has he been responsive? I mean, do you think that
He has to say to me the same thing that he says to everybody else, which is, okay, we'll be waiting for it. So he knows we're working hard.
That's good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The House Intelligence Committee holds its first open hearing of the impeachment inquiry against President Trump next week. Lawmakers will hear testimony from William Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent. We'll have live impeachment coverage Wednesday morning starting at 10 Eastern on C-SPAN 3. And then on Friday, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, will testify at the House Intelligence Committee's impeachment inquiry. That'll be live at 10 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. You can also follow our live impeachment coverage online at cspan.org and listen with the free C-SPAN radio app. This week on C-SPAN 3 at 8 p.m. Eastern, watch samples of our history coverage featured every weekend on American History TV. Tonight, a look at past impeachment proceedings for Presidents Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton. And Friday, the American Revolution. American History TV features all week at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3. At cspan.org, we're making it easier for you to watch C-SPAN's coverage of the impeachment inquiry and the administration's response. If you miss any of our live coverage, go to our impeachment inquiry page at cspan.org/impeachment for video on demand. And we've added a tally from the Associated Press showing where each House Democrat stands on the impeachment inquiry against President Trump. Follow the impeachment inquiry on our webpage at cspan.org/impeachment. It's your fast and easy way to watch C-SPAN's unfiltered coverage anytime.
And we're joined next by Casey Burgett, who's a senior fellow with the Government's Project at the R Street Institute in Washington, here to look ahead to next week's public hearings of the impeachment inquiry in the Senate, the House Intelligence Committee. When you heard the news yesterday that the phase would switch to a public phase, what were your thoughts about your expectations for those hearings?
First and foremost, I was surprised how quick these are coming. This timeline is so compressed; it's going incredibly fast, and it's even surprising a lot of us who follow this on a day-to-day basis, just of how fast this is proceeding and how quick Democrats want to make their case publicly.
What do you suppose that, because of the people they will interview next week have all testified behind closed doors, what do you suppose that the committee hopes to hear in public or hopes to draw out in public that they didn't in closed door hearings?
Right. So Democrats want to hear what they've already heard behind closed doors. They're so willing to move on this so quickly because they are confident in the case they have. They're confident in the testimony that they have received in those depositions behind closed doors. Republicans are hopeful that they can use the public opportunity to show misrememberings or to show confusion or to show chinks in the armor between corroborating witnesses about what they remember and when, just to try to get some confusion and some chinks in that case that Democrats are trying to lay out.
Based on the resolution that passed last week in the full House, what's your understanding of the process of how those hearings will take place?
Right. So the Intelligence Committee is going to take a lead, which is different from investigations or impeachment inquiries in the past, which are typically under the jurisdiction of the House Judiciary Committee. So Speaker Pelosi has tapped Adam Schiff as chairman to lead these public efforts. She likes the way that he's conducted this and mostly is able to bring this intelligence perspective to the proceedings. So it's going to transition into a public setting where there's going to be more of a back and forth. And of course, cameras are going to be on it. It's going to look more like a courtroom than what the behind the scenes depositions look like, or a typical committee hearing would look like, but it's going to be public and it's going to be for all eyes to see.
There's been reports of the Republicans wanting Jim Jordan from Oversight to sit in on those, to sit temporarily on intelligence, and Mark Meadows as well. What do you think is behind their thinking on that?
They want public defenders of the president, and Mr. Meadows and Mr. Jordan are exactly that. They're forceful, they are loyal backers, and they are smart as a whip. They're not shy to get combative with witnesses, and Republicans may think they might need that when the cameras start turning on.
Casey Burgett is our guest. We'd appreciate to welcome your comments too about next week's hearing as we continue the discussion on the impeachment inquiry. Democrats use 202-748-8000. Republicans, it's 202-748-8001. And for independents and others, 202-748-8002. Wanted to show you a opinion piece from Betsy McGaughey, the former New York State Attorney General. This is in the New York Post. The headline of it says, Pelosi's impeachment rules guarantee a partisan circus. But I wanted to point out part of it. She says that Democrats are boasting about the impeachment inquiry protections offered to Trump, claiming they're the same rules devised for President Nixon and President Clinton, but that's a bald-faced lie. Section F, quietly devised by Judiciary Committee Chair Gerald Nadler, stipulates that unless the president surrenders his executive privilege, a power even the Supreme Court has ruled vital to his office, he and his lawyers will be denied any ability to call or answer or question witnesses, I should say. What is this Section F?
Right. So two things come to mind when that's read. First of all, I think this was guaranteed to be a partisan circus no matter what happens. When the cameras turn on with something as big as impeachment, you're going to get a lot of partisan warfare, undercutting the process, and Democrats saying one thing, Republicans saying another. With this Section F, this is a provision that is important to talk about. It was passed, not even passed, but it was passed by the Judiciary Committee, independent of that House resolution we saw last week, which set the broad procedures of the impeachment inquiry. It gives a power to the Judiciary Committee to basically have the president forfeit his impeachment rights if he does not comply with the investigations of any committee referenced in that impeachment resolution last week. So it's basically a sign that Democrats are ready to play hardball, that if the president doesn't comply with their congressional subpoenas and provide witnesses and documents, as he hasn't done yet, then they're going to take away some of his rights within those impeachment proceedings as a way to kind of force compliance.
So this was language that just the judiciary discussed and approved of. This was not voted on by the full House.
Correct.
Here's what that language says for our viewers and listeners. Section F, should the president unlawfully refuse to make witnesses available for testimony or to produce documents requested by the investigative committees listed in the first section of H.Res. 660, the one that passed, in furtherance of the investigations described in this first section, the chair shall have the discretion to impose appropriate remedies, including by denying specific requests by the president or his counsel under these procedures, or to call or question witnesses. But it seems like they're just setting it up because the president and the administration have withheld witnesses. They have withheld testimony, at least so far.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of it's a preemptive measure to just warn the administration that as we transition into a more public phase, as we are still requesting information and documents because this is moving so fast, if you continue to stonewall, then you are setting yourself up for some denial of rights that you're going to want when these impeachment proceedings begin.
Let's get to calls. Our guest, Casey Burgett, the topic, impeachment, the public hearings beginning next week. Our Republican line is first, and Bill is in Hazelwood, Missouri. Good morning.
Yeah, I'm calling from the 1st Congressional District, which is the very democratically gerrymandered. And I would like to fly into Washington, and I'm wondering, as a member of the public, what are the procedures and what access would I have to actually attending the hearing as a member of the public?
As far as I understand it right now, just like most other committee hearings, these will be public hearings in both in person and then on television, obviously. So I would recommend you show up early. These are going to be well attended by the public and everyone within the bubble here. This is not a common thing, so people are going to get in line early. So if you're flying in, I'd get your ticket now.
Yeah, and I think that our earlier guest, Julie Grace Brufke from The Hill, reported that they're moving. They'll have these in the Ways and Means, a bigger room to accommodate a larger audience, but we hope you get in. Michael's in Niceville, Florida on our Democrats line. Go ahead.
Thank you. You're correct. I am Michael Brady, and I am from Niceville, Florida, and I'm a Democrat. Why the American people need to study and evaluate the situation of the impeachment proceedings to check either the right or the left and try to find a happy or median ground in the middle. But my main concern is why, if these proceedings continue on, will Trump have the advantage of refusal or actually obstructing the process, and the representatives, congressional representatives, Jordan and also Collins from Georgia, and I think several others. I watched very seriously the various committee meetings that they've had when Representative Elijah Cummings was moderator and head of the meeting itself. But the point I'm making, those particular congressmen had done nothing but to obstruct and break up the meeting as much as they can in reference to supporting President Trump. But I think the Democrats were able to, in a lot of these meetings, were able to proceed with the meeting and make a completion and a proper evaluation of it. What we're having to deal with is that Jordan was in one of the closed meetings. He came out and he was leaking information what was going on in the particular meeting. We don't need this trash talking back and forth, which have been ongoing. The Democrats have had the opportunity to do a lot of things. They passed a lot of legislation in the House that has been forwarded to the Senate. I think there's probably some 400 pieces of legislation there that hasn't been acted upon. And I hear these comments from callers coming in, or the do-nothing Democrats from the Republicans, that the Democrats aren't doing anything.
All right, Michael, let you go there. Casey Burgett.
There's a lot there, but I think that it's important to recognize that as we transition to this more public side, that we should be conscious of what we're about to see. And that is going to be Democrats making their case very forcefully. They're going to say that the president did wrong, and anyone that's defending him is breaking their oath to the Constitution. On the Republican side, they're going to attack just the opposite. So to think that we're going to come into a kumbaya moment is probably naive, and that we should look to this as going to be a contentious process. This is not supposed to be an easy thing to pass, and it won't be. So we should go into that with eyes wide open and try to make the best judgment we can with the evidence brought to bear.
A lot has been said about by the president and his supporters of the lack of due process in this in the impeachment inquiry so far. Do you think that these public hearings in particular will help clarify what is due process in an impeachment hearing for, President?
Right. So this is one of the biggest pieces of confusion right now, and that is relating what we know about the courtroom. It's a familiar process, right? It's something we see on TV. We know a jury in trial, and we know in general what rights we're supposed to have as a defendant. But we haven't reached the court stage of this yet. The investigation so far is in the fact-gathering stage. It's happening behind closed doors, which is a little different than in past, but in previous proceedings, it's done by special counsel. That was behind closed doors. We weren't privy to that, but the president will begin to receive his rights because we're transitioning into that relative court stage where he will be able to call witnesses, be represented by counsel, be able to cross-examine witnesses once they do take the stage. So it's important to know that we haven't reached that court stage. No matter what you've been hearing about due process rights, we haven't been there yet. And next week's hearing is the first start of that, where you will see the defendant be able to be represented and be able to cross-examine and present evidence themselves.
It's always helpful to go back to the Constitution. So little is said about impeachment. It is Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5. The House of Representatives shall choose, that's how they spell it, their speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. We go to Punta Gorda, Florida. I'm sorry, Joanne, on the Republican line. Go ahead.
Hi. This is Joanne. I'm calling from Punta Gorda, and my feelings are that there isn't any such thing as a whistleblower. I think the whole thing is made up. And the first thing that convinced me was when Adam Schiff was lying about what Trump had said on the call. I heard it with my own ears. He talked about the phone call that he had with the Ukraine prime minister, and it was totally false. And it was totally false and different than the actual call. And people need to read the transcript of the call. But I believe that everything's been set up just like the Russian collusion and just like the Mueller report. And I have heard no facts yet. All I keep hearing is interpretation. Everybody's interpretation. I think, I believe. And I want to welcome President Trump to Florida. And have a wonderful morning. Thank you.
Okay, Joanne. Casey Burgett, tell us about what the Democrats are focusing on, what they hope to establish as an article or articles of impeachment.
Right. As you mentioned, that the Constitution says so precious little about what impeachment is and how it's supposed to be carried out. It does give some threshold of what crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors, treason and bribery meet the threshold for impeachment, but even that is broad. There's been 60 impeachment efforts in the House of Representatives. 16 have been voted for impeachment, but 11 of those 16 have no criminal act within their articles of impeachment, meaning that they were voted out, they were impeached without committing a criminal act. So we think of this as a criminal act. Something has to be done that broke a statute or broke a law. It doesn't necessarily have to be true. Impeachment is what the political actors within the House of Representatives say is impeachable right now. And so Democrats are trying to say that it's going to likely revolve around abuse of power, a decommitment from the oath of office, of putting American interests first by putting his electoral concerns first, and then probably an obstruction of Congress, obstruction of the proceedings, not complying with witnesses. I'm anxious to see what articles, if they come out, say. But they're trying to make this case fast, and they're trying to make it publicly.
A reminder for some historical perspective, our impeachment website, cspan.org/impeachment, not only current video from the current impeachment inquiry, but we've linked to all of our coverage from the Bill Clinton impeachment inquiry, all of our coverage from the impeachment of a number of judges over the course of the 40 years plus of the C-SPAN history. You'll find that all at cspan.org/impeachment. We go to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Rosemary on the independent line.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
When Adam Schiff interviewed the people, I think it was their opinion. They disagree with the president's policy. There are 3 branches of government, and the president is entitled to determine his foreign policy. And what's happening with the IG report and Durham's report? We haven't heard anything about that. That should tell us the beginnings of what happened before 2016 and 2016. Thank you.
And Rosemary, just to let you know, we read a story yesterday that IG report will likely come out in the next week or so. You can find that. From the Hill, their headline, Senators Push for Deal on Impeachment Trial Rules to Avoid a Political Brawl. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was asked yesterday how long a Senate trial would take and whether President Trump would be convicted and removed from office. Here's what Mitch McConnell had to say.
How long it goes on really just depends on how long the Senate wants to spend on it. I will say I'm pretty sure how it's likely to end. If it were today, I don't think there's any question it would not lead to a removal. So the question is just how long does the Senate want to take? How long do the presidential candidates want to be here on the floor of the Senate instead of in Iowa and New Hampshire? And all of these other related issues that may be going on at the same time. It's very difficult to ascertain, how long this takes. I'd be surprised if it didn't end the way the two previous ones did, with the president not being removed from office.
Casey Burgett, how difficult is it for Republican leadership in particular in the Senate not to give away or say things that may prejudice an eventual trial of President Trump?
Right, and I think that applies to Democratic senators too, who are also going to be potential jurors if this gets past the House. So I am sympathetic to the argument that they, like all of us, should wait for the evidence to become public. Even members of the United States Senate aren't privy to the information that's been deposed behind closed doors. So we are all, as many callers say, we're all using a lot of speculation. We're using leaks right now. We're using the public testimonies that are starting to drip out right now. So we do not have the full picture, and I don't even think the committees investigating this have the full picture by evidence of them still asking witnesses to come in, still asking for documents. So this is the consequence of moving so fast. So if you look back at Nixon, the Watergate break-ins were famously done in July of '72. It wasn't until July of '74, 2 full years later, that the public hearings, the stage we're about to enter in now, started to happen. With Clinton, it was January of '94 that the special prosecutor started his operations, and then it wasn't until December '98 when Clinton was actually impeached. So these are 2 years, 4 years. Right now, we're 3 months away. So a very compressed timeline, which affects all of this info.
Back to calls. We hear from Ann, Albertville, Minnesota, on our Democrats line.
Yes. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. My question is it really legal for the president to withhold all his documents and other things that should be available in any investigation?
That is a question that we're about to see a ton of lawsuits in the Supreme Court likely to get involved to itemize exactly what the prerogatives of Congress are relative to the executive branch, particularly when he has an ability to invoke executive privilege. Right now, there's a famous court case going on when someone within the executive branch was subpoenaed by Congress, but he was directed by the executive branch, by the president, not to testify. So he's literally asking, do I listen to Congress or do I listen to the president? And surprisingly, that hasn't been decided so clearly yet. So we're waiting for court cases. We're waiting for a back and forth of negotiations between the two branches. And it's just signals that a lot of this in previous efforts was done sometimes by the courts, and a lot of times when it got to those final stages, it was done by the courts. But a lot of this is done by precedents, by norms of just what is expected between the two branches, but nothing is set in stone. So a lot of us are looking for clarity on that exact issue.
But you pointed out the pace of this impeachment inquiry this time could outpace results from the court. The impeachment inquiry could certainly wrap up before any decision by the court, let alone even a hearing in a court on these issues of executive privilege.
Right. And even the courts right now are moving as fast relative to other court cases. And the House Democrats have decided that they might not necessarily need that to be decided for them to make a strong case. So they're moving on with or without that court. I think they would like to get the hearing as soon as possible, assuming that it's one that provides information to them, but they're moving on with under the assumption that they won't.
Here's Roland next, Independent Line, New Braunfels, Texas.
Yes, good morning. Yes, I'm calling to say let the facts flow. Let the facts show us, the American people, what is there that the testimonies from these witnesses have given. I'm an independent, and I live in the Austin-San Antonio corridor, and I have friends from all walks of life, all different lines, political lines, and they are ready for the facts. And they're not zombied out like many of these Republicans that are diehard Trumpers, saying, I will not listen to the facts. This is a sham. I won't listen to anything that comes forth. No, you have to listen. This is trying to preserve our constitutional republic from unlawful acts, corrupt conduct, abuse of power, the betrayal to our country, and the list can go on. Independents have to realize that, that we have to be open and listen to those facts. And Republicans saying that they're not going to listen to anything, that's already a sign that the republic is in jeopardy. Senators are being paid like Ernst in Iowa by the Trump campaign. Hey, we'll give you money. So, hey, I'm trying to buy you off already on what you might have to do in the Senate, be the jury. But a president can be impeached and removed for his or her actions, even if they aren't consistent with the presidential duties, whether or not it violates criminal law. He's been violated the oath of office for a while with the emoluments clause, and by saying it's phony, there's the problem. Anybody who says the Constitution is phony, there we have a problem, America. So wake up, people, wake up, Americans, and do what's right. Save our country. For not for ourselves, but for our children, our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you. Casey Bergen.
Yeah, Roland, you're obviously informed. You pay attention. So I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment that the facts should reign supreme, and we're about ready to transition into a phase where those facts are going to become readily available to all Americans that want to do it. I'm not going to be naive enough to say that everyone from both stripes, both extremes, are going to accept them equally, but at least they will be presented before us. They're going to have to make their case, and members of Congress face the unfortunate duty of deciding whether that warrants impeachment and maybe ultimate removal. But that's the path we're on right now. And so facts are about ready to become available to all of us, whether we want to see them or not.
Karen in Pittsburgh texts this to us. A question for you. Why doesn't Trump testify himself in open hearing?
I think his lawyers wouldn't love that, but if everything I understand says that he has that prerogative, if his lawyers allow it, and if the House wants to hear from him, that is a right of someone facing a charge like this. But I cannot imagine the president taking a stand within the House or the Senate.
Where would that come? Would that come in a House hearing or an eventual Senate trial?
I think it can come from at any point within the House and Senate obviously make their own rules, especially in regards to impeachment in the process. And I can't even get my head around him showing up and taking the oath